Welcome to my channel, The Good Book Tales. In today's story, we step back into a world of power, faith, and unshakable courage. A world where the fate of one man would shape the destiny of millions. This is not just another story about history. This is the final chapter of one of the most remarkable figures to ever walk the earth. The Apostle Paul. His words filled letters that still echo in churches today, but behind those sacred writings is a man who stood face to face with the might of Rome, a man who lived and died with unbreakable conviction. Tonight, we uncover the truth about the Apostle Paul's final days and the shadow of Nero, the emperor who sought to silence him forever. Imagine it, the bustling city of Rome in the 1st century. Crowded streets filled with merchants, soldiers, slaves, and whispers of unrest. Rome was the beating heart of the empire, but it was also a place of suspicion and danger for anyone who dared to challenge its gods, its traditions, or its authority. And right in the middle of this storm stood Paul, a man who once persecuted followers of Jesus, now transformed into their greatest messenger. His voice carried across seas, across borders, and into the very core of the Roman world. But in the eyes of Emperor Nero, Paul was more than just a preacher. He was a threat. Nero was no ordinary ruler. He was young, ambitious, and consumed with a hunger for control. His reign was marked by extravagance, suspicion, and ruthless decisions. To him, Christians were strange, troublesome people, followers of a crucified man who refused to honor Rome's gods. When the Great Fire of Rome tore through the city in AD 64, leaving destruction and fear in its wake, Nero found an easy target to blame: the Christians. And in this dangerous climate, the Apostle Paul, already imprisoned, became a symbol of everything Nero wished to crush. Picture Paul in his final days. The once tireless traveler who braved storms, prison chains, and hostile crowds now sat in a Roman cell, surrounded by cold stone walls. His body bore the scars of beatings and shipwrecks, yet his spirit remained unbroken. He wrote with urgency, pouring his heart into letters to his companions, encouraging them to hold fast, to keep the faith, to endure what was coming. Paul knew his end was near, but his words reveal a man who feared nothing. Not death, not Nero, not the might of Rome itself. But what exactly happened in those last days? How did Paul meet his death? Was it swift, or was it filled with suffering? Ancient historians hint at the truth, but details remain cloaked in mystery. Some say he was beheaded on the orders of Nero, a fate considered merciful for a Roman citizen. Others wonder if there was more to his final hours, more that history chose not to record. As we piece together the accounts of Paul's execution, we see not just the fall of one man, but the rise of an unstoppable faith. His death, far from silencing his message, became the seed of a movement that would outlast Nero, outlast Rome itself, and spread to the ends of the earth. But before we reveal how it all unfolded, we must walk carefully through the final steps of Paul's journey. The betrayals, the imprisonments, the powerful sermons given with chains around his wrists. So, stay with me. Because the story of Paul's final days is not just about history, it's about courage, conviction, and the price of truth. And as we trace his last moments under Nero's shadow, we will discover how a man condemned by an emperor became a voice that would never be silenced. What was it really like when Paul faced his death? And what secrets still remain hidden in the ruins of Rome? That is where our journey begins. The streets of Rome in Paul's time were alive with noise and power, but beneath the surface, there was always a current of fear. Soldiers patrolled the marketplaces, tax collectors demanded payment, and whispers about the strange new movement called the Way passed from one ear to another. Christianity was still small, fragile in numbers, yet its message spread like fire. For many Romans, this message of one God, of love and forgiveness, sounded like a dangerous challenge to the empire's order. And for Paul, once a persecutor himself, every step he took toward Rome was another step into the very heart of danger. Paul was no stranger to prisons. From Philippi to Caesarea, chains had often been his companions. Yet Rome was different. The capital was not just another city. It was the seat of Nero, the emperor who could decide a man's fate with a word. By the time Paul was brought there, his reputation was well known. He was not just a preacher wandering from town to town. He was a man whose letters had reached distant believers, whose bold words about Christ stirred both devotion and hostility. To the Christians scattered across the empire, Paul was a shepherd. To Nero and his officials, Paul was a threat. What makes this moment so gripping is the mystery that surrounds it. Ancient accounts agree that Paul was executed, but the details are few, leaving us with fragments to piece together. Why did Nero allow Paul, a Roman citizen, to speak and write until the very end? Was the emperor himself intrigued by this stubborn man who refused to bend? Or was Paul simply another victim caught in a storm far bigger than himself? A storm fueled by suspicion after the great fire of Rome. That fire burned for days, leaving the city in ruins and the people desperate for someone to blame. Rumors spread that Nero himself had played a part in the disaster, and the emperor needed an answer, a scapegoat. Christians became the target, accused of crimes, and dragged into the public eye. It was in this charged atmosphere that Paul's trial and eventual sentence unfolded. His name, his message, and his unshakable faith now collided with the ruthless politics of Rome. And yet, in the midst of this darkness, Paul's writings shine brighter. Even while imprisoned, he sent words of encouragement, urging his followers to remain strong, to endure suffering with hope, to keep their eyes fixed on something greater than the empire of Nero. It is this contrast, the cold reality of Rome's power and the burning faith of one man, that makes Paul's final days so haunting and so unforgettable. But what exactly led him from his prison cell to the place of execution? And why does history leave us with silence where we expect answers? The tension grows, and the truth waits in the shadows. The heart of the conflict was not only between Paul and Nero, but between two worlds that could not exist together. On one side stood the Roman Empire, built on power, loyalty to the emperor, and the worship of many gods. On the other side was a small but growing community of believers, people who proclaimed that Jesus alone was Lord. To Rome, this was not just a private belief. It was defiance. Refusing to honor the emperor as divine was seen as treason, and treason had only one ending. For Paul, this clash was more than political. He knew the cost of speaking boldly, but he also knew the cost of silence. His mission had always been clear, to spread the message of Christ to the ends of the earth. Now, in the shadow of Nero's rule, that mission became both more dangerous and more urgent. Letters from this time reveal not a man crushed by fear, but a man burning with conviction, urging Timothy, Titus, and others to stay strong. Behind his words, though, we sense the weight of what he faced: loneliness, betrayal, and the ever-present knowledge that the executioner's sword could fall at any moment. And there were other layers to this story. Some Roman citizens were curious about Paul's teaching, perhaps even sympathetic, while others saw him as nothing but a disturber of peace. Among the Christians themselves, fear spread quickly. If Paul, their leader, could be taken and condemned, what would become of them? Families hid their faith, communities met in secret, and prayers rose in whispers across the city. Every believer lived with the knowledge that Nero's anger might strike next. Yet even here, in the uncertainty, Paul's presence seemed larger than life, His defiance was not loud rebellion, but quiet endurance, and that endurance carried a message Nero could never control. And still, the end was closing in. The days of waiting must have felt endless, each sunrise bringing Paul closer to the moment everyone feared, but no one could name aloud. The prison walls pressed in around him, yet his words carried far beyond them. Visitors came in secret, carrying messages, carrying tears, carrying the weight of knowing that this man's fate was already sealed. Some begged him to soften his tone, to appeal to Nero, to choose life over death. But Paul's heart was fixed. He had already counted the cost, and he knew that backing down now would not save him. It would only silence the truth he had lived for. Outside, Rome itself seemed to breathe with tension. The scars of the great fire still lingered, whole districts reduced to ash, and the anger of the people demanded more than excuses. Nero's search for blame had already spilled blood, and the prisons overflowed with believers accused of crimes they had never committed. Every execution, every spectacle in the arena only added to the fear. Yet Paul's case was different. His trial was not just about one man, it was about what his life represented. If the empire could silence Paul, perhaps it could silence the movement he had given everything to build. And so, the whispers grew. Some said Paul would be beheaded swiftly, given the small mercy owed to a Roman citizen. Others wondered if Nero would make a spectacle of him, turning his death into another warning for the crowds. Paul himself gave no sign of fear, but those closest to him felt the weight of what was coming. Each night in the prison must have carried the same unspoken question. Would tomorrow be his last? The moment was drawing near, the final test of faith and power. All that remained was for Nero to give the word. But just when it seemed that Paul's fate was sealed, and nothing more could unfold, the story took an unexpected turn. For in those final days, there were rumors, whispers that even inside Nero's palace, not everyone agreed with the emperor's brutal treatment of Christians. Some sources suggest that Paul's words had reached further than anyone realized, that among the guards and officials who watched over him, there were a few who listened quietly, who carried questions in their hearts. Could it be that the message Paul carried, the message that had traveled from Jerusalem to the heart of Rome, had found its way into the very halls of power? This possibility raised the stakes even higher. If Paul's preaching could touch not only slaves and common people, but also those tied to Nero's court, then his death would not simply silence him. It might turn him into a martyr whose influence grew even stronger. To Nero, already shaken by the unrest in Rome and the whispers of conspiracy against his throne, this made Paul more dangerous than ever. The emperor's rage was not just political, it was personal. He could not afford to let this man inspire loyalty even within his own ranks. Meanwhile, the Christians of Rome faced their own crisis. Some argued that Paul's capture was a sign to scatter, to protect the fragile community from total destruction. Others believed they should stand near him until the end, to prove that faith could outlast fear. In the secret meetings of believers, debates rose and emotions clashed. Every choice carried risk, and every voice trembled under the shadow of Nero's wrath. Paul's life was no longer just his own. It had become a test of the entire Christian community's resolve. The tension escalated further when word spread that Paul might not be the only one targeted. Other leaders, perhaps even Peter, faced the same looming danger. Nero's net was wide, and no one knew who would be seized next. The fear of betrayal added another layer of danger. Could spies already be among them, listening to their prayers, watching their movements, ready to hand them over? And still, in the midst of this uncertainty, Paul's calm presence only deepened the mystery. He spoke of finishing the race, of fighting the good fight, as if he already stood at the finish line. But to those around him, the suspense was unbearable. Would Nero move quickly to strike, Or would the emperor wait, plotting something even more dramatic? The storm had not yet broken, but its dark clouds gathered closer with each passing hour. The day finally came when the tension could no longer be contained. The streets of Rome buzzed with rumors and whispers, the shadow of Nero's palace looming over the city like a storm about to break. Paul was led from his cell, his steps steady, his face calm, as if the weight of chains and fear could not touch him. Around him the guards exchanged nervous glances, some perhaps questioning the justice of what they were about to witness. The crowd that had gathered, both curious Romans and hidden believers, waited in silence, the air thick with anticipation. As Paul approached the place of execution, his mind must have raced through years of journeys, hardships, and victories. This was the culmination of a life spent spreading a message that refused to die. Nero, watching from his elevated position, expected to see defiance broken. Yet what he saw instead was unshakable courage. Paul's presence alone seemed to turn the act of punishment into a moment of quiet triumph. Every letter he had written, every sermon he had delivered, every life he had touched, culminated here, in a way Nero could neither erase nor control. The execution itself was swift, as the law allowed for a Roman citizen. Yet even in those final moments, Paul's influence rippled outward. Witnesses spoke of a calmness that defied fear, of a strength that seemed larger than life. For the Christians hiding in secret corners of Rome, it was as if the message itself had become visible, tangible, and unbreakable. Nero's attempt to silence one man had instead cemented a legacy that would outlive emperors, armies, and empires. But just when it seemed that the story had reached its inevitable conclusion, an unexpected twist emerged. Among the crowd were envoys from distant provinces, scribes and messengers who had carried Paul's letters far and wide. They had seen the courage of this man firsthand, and vowed to preserve his teachings, to spread them even further than before. And some of the guards, moved by the integrity and faith of the prisoner they had escorted, quietly began to question the emperor's actions, their loyalties shifting in subtle, almost imperceptible ways. The climax, intense and harrowing, revealed not just the fall of one man, but the unstoppable force of ideas and faith. Paul's death was meant to be an ending, yet in truth it became the beginning of something far greater. Rome could punish the body, but it could not touch the spirit, the message, or the enduring courage that had transformed the city, and would continue to echo across centuries. And as the crowd dispersed, one lingering question remained. What new alliances, what unseen movements had already begun to take shape in the shadows of that fateful day? As the dust settled over the streets of Rome, the impact of Paul's final moments began to unfold in ways that no one, not even Nero, could have anticipated. Christians emerged from hiding, their grief tempered by a sense of awe and renewed purpose. Paul's courage had shown them that faith was stronger than fear, that truth could endure even in the face of the mightiest empire. Families gathered in secret homes, reading his letters aloud, finding guidance and hope in the words of a man who had faced death without flinching. What was meant to silence a voice instead amplified it, spreading a message that would cross borders, oceans, and generations. The believers realized that Paul's life had been a blueprint for resilience. Every trial he endured, every shipwreck, imprisonment, and beatings had led to this moment, a demonstration that conviction and courage could not be chained. His example inspired leaders within the Christian community to step forward, to take responsibility for spreading the faith, and to protect the fragile network of believers that had been tested under Nero's wrath. What had begun as fear transformed into unity and determination, as the movement Paul had built found new strength in adversity. Even beyond the Christian community, Paul's story left a subtle mark on Rome itself. Some guards, once indifferent or obedient, began quietly questioning the morality of the empire's harsh measures. Others carried the tale to distant provinces, recounting the calm dignity of a man who chose faith over fear. Nero, for all his power, could not control how history would remember Paul, nor could he undo the influence of the letters that had already reached far corners of the empire. In this way, the execution, intended to end a life, had instead planted seeds that would flourish long after Rome had moved on. As the city returned to its routines, one truth remained clear. The death of Paul was not the end of the story. It was a turning point, a testament to the enduring power of faith, courage, and conviction. From his journeys across the Mediterranean to his final days under Nero's shadow, Paul had lived a life that challenged authority, inspired communities, and reshaped history. The lesson for those who followed was unmistakable. One life, committed to truth, could outlast the most formidable forces on earth. And so, the story of Paul's final days became more than history. It became a symbol, a guiding light, and a call to stand firm when the world tests what we hold most dear.